Samaya, for the report and for the fantastic and internationally recognised work that you're doing.
Thank you.
So I'm happy to move that you're welcome to take a seat now. I'm happy to move that the committee receive the memo entitled Welcoming Communities Annual Update, presented to the Community Committee on the 20th of March. I'll look for a seconder. Councillor Barrett, thank you. Just a few comments from me. I am a member of the advisory group, so I'm very familiar with the work that is going on. But I think it's really important that the work is presented to committee on an annual basis to just shine a light, I suppose, on the very many ways that are being used and developed to make people feel welcome in the city. So when we say that we want to be a welcoming community, it's not just about saying it, it's about doing it, as far as I'm concerned. And I think when we see the different types of events, the different programs that are being run, and as Samaya mentioned, the very strong relationships that have been built over the years, it does really speak to the commitment of council to make this a very welcoming community. So just I'm very grateful for the work that Samaya coordinates, but also all of the people who are involved. There are lots of stakeholders involved in making this a success. And every year there seems to be something new being developed. And I mean, it is no exaggeration to say that Palmerston North has got international recognition as a welcoming community. And there's a reason why Samaya was invited to go over to Australia to speak. There's also a reason why Christina Pope, the Director of Welcoming International, came to do a visit in the city. So I think it's a project that we could be very proud of, albeit it was piloted by Immigration New Zealand. We then took it over and funded it locally, and I think it's been a tremendous success, and no doubt will continue to be in the future. So thank you very much, Samaya. No one else in the queue to speak, so we will vote. Thank you. None against. We'll note that numbers are dropping, and I do need to maintain a quorum, so please consider whether or not you need to leave the meeting before we finish. Thank you. Okay, so to the next report, which is the Community Housing Partnership Fund update, and I will invite Julie MacDonald, Strategy and Policy Manager, to speak to it. Welcome, Julie.
Kia ora koutou. This is a very quick report, I'm hoping. This is about the Community Housing Partnership Fund, which is a new fund proposed through the LTP, the proposed LTP. Through the development of the LTP, there was quite a lot of discussion about the research and development that would be needed to put this fund together, to make sure that it's useful and also going to be delivering on the outcomes that you've prioritised. So this report is just to note that at the moment, in the proposed LTP, the development of the fund would happen within current resources in year one, but also that there's no budget provision for the fund itself that will start in year two unless you decide otherwise. In the meantime, I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Julie. Councillor Wood.
Thank you, Madam Chair. A number of questions from me. First one being probably, why has there been no progress in the past 10 months on this, given we were told that there would be resource available to do this, so that we had a plan that we could then resource at the LTP stage? Why has that not happened?
I might ask the two relevant GMs to respond to that. My understanding is that when the proposal was made for a fund, there were various bits of advice about whether additional resources would be needed to develop the fund itself. Councillors declined to allocate those resources, so at that point it became evident that this would happen in year one, and that proposal has been around for quite some months now.
Well, I'm sorry, but my recollection was we had funds in there, and the advice from the managers was that this would be able to be funded, or would be able to be progressed through the existing resource, and that it didn't need it. Not where there was no mention that that would not be done till year one. So I guess my question is that not your understanding of what?
I think the GM, David Murphy, would like to comment. His light has come on.
Yeah, through you, Madam Chair. David Murphy, Chief Planning Officer. The most recent advice in late 2023 as part of the LTP deliberations is as per the recommended memo that work is done within existing resources in year one, and that would then inform a potential fund from year two if the council decided to do so. As indicated within the report, I think there are also a number of connected and related considerations the council will need to think about in relationship to any fund. So, for instance, our approach to social housing, the way in which we use our land, will all have an impact in relationship on the nature of any fund. So, I've said in this chamber and in workshops a number of times, there's a whole bunch of mechanisms the council can pull in regards to housing. The way in which we use our land is one of those. The way in which we fund and deliver social housing is another one. So the fund shouldn't be viewed in isolation from the other policy decisions the council makes regarding social housing.
All right, thank you. I'll move on to my next question then. Why is it now a fund, not a partnership program as was requested? Why are we talking about a community housing partnership fund, given that's not the resolution that was passed, nor is that what councillors asked for? It's in point 2.1
Sure.
on page 271, the original recommendation.
So the action that's been developed in the proposed housing plan is to describe to the community the purpose of this funding. So our understanding is that the action in the housing plan reflects the resolution of councillors that there be a fund.
So, do you recall that at the time this was proposed, that 3 potential areas were proposed, 1 being planning advice and support, 2 being potentially a pathway for access to land for community housing organisations, and 3 being potentially funding? And if you do recall that, how have those first 2 points been reflected in this report and in officers' planning?
I do indeed recall that conversation, Councillor Wood, and it happened in a workshop, which is a non-decision making forum. So the resolution that we have on the table here is for there to be a fund delivered in year 2, and the purpose of this report is to make it really clear to you as to what progress has been made into the years that you have allocated those actions.
I apologise, Madam Chair, but that answer we just received is not correct. So when that proposal that we have in point 2.1 was put forward, speeches were given, and it was quite clearly stated those 3 points were what we were looking for in that program. So I'm trying to understand, yes, the conversation was had at a workshop, and that workshop led to a proposal, which is what this now builds out from. It was.
I can just add a little bit, and then I think David wants to add too. So there hasn't been any detailed fleshing out of the proposal, which is why officers have consistently said, and my understanding is that elected members were in agreement, that there needed to be, for example, some surveying of community housing providers to see the kind of support that they would want and that would be most useful, so that rather than just putting a fund in place and then trying to work out what would be the best use of it, that we would do some research and development of a fund so that once it was up and going, it would be the most effective.
Okay,
and David may well
so
want to-
are the aspects of this that aren't fund related? So, for example, providing free planning advice or potentially a grant to provide access to organisations looking at getting set up to access legal services or accounting services, how is that being progressed, given that's specifically not a fund?
So those things would all be part of this piece of work when we're asking community housing providers what sort of support they would like to receive, and then that advice would come back to elected members to help then shape that program. Because
Right.
as I've pointed out, there's no funding allocated in year 2 at this stage.
So
I'm just going to stop you there, Councillor, because I
thank you.
realise David Murphy's waiting to make a comment.
Yeah, through you, Madam Chair. I guess I would just reiterate that currently we have a draft LTP that's with Audit New Zealand. It'll be coming back to Council on the 3rd of April. The Council has approved, in principle, a housing plan which includes all the actions associated with housing. If the Councillor would like to, I guess, make a change to the content of the draft LTP or the housing plan, then that will be available to the Council on the 3rd of April.
Thank you. So under point 2.6, where you suggest that we could put a figure in the LTP, how would you recommend we do that, given we have no plan that we would be resourcing? Would you suggest we just make a figure up and put it in there and hope that it might be correct?
The report is my advice to you, and no, I haven't suggested that you put a figure in the LTP.
Okay.
What I'm trying to do is be really clear that councillors know that you haven't done that at this stage, but if you did want to do that, as deliberations happen or between now and then on the 3rd of April, that's your opportunity to do so. The reason for this report is to provide clarity to you that this is at the stage it's at, and that's what's being proposed through the LTP at this stage.
All right, final question, Madam Chair, then.
I'll just caution you about your tone, councillor.
Thank you. If councillors wanted to see more action on this at a faster rate, what, in your view, would be the appropriate way for us to reflect that? Would it be through a notice of motion to council with a much clearer idea of what we're looking for, or would it be to simply wait until next year and deal with it then?
I guess my response to that would be it would depend what you meant by faster action. If you mean to provide more support to community housing providers, then my advice would always be that it would be really good to talk with them to find out what kind of support they would like.
All right, thank you, Madam Chair.
Councillor Naylor.
Thank you. Just my question relates to year one, that you mentioned that work will carry out within existing resource. What is the budget amount for that work to happen in year one?
That just means within existing staff resourcing. It's not an additional line item.
Okay, so I realise it's not additional, it's existing, but does it not have a dollar value on that piece of work in terms of, so in our year one, in our LTP, what is the financial amount that's attached to that piece of work?
My understanding is, and we've yet to talk about this in detail, but that would just become part of the normal work program of various teams, and we'll accommodate that within our work planning.
Yeah, I hear that. I'm just trying to
I'm unable to give you
quantify that.
I'm unable to give you a dollar figure because
Yeah.
we're talking about staffing.
Yeah, okay. So in our LTP, where would we find that sort of information? Because all the operational programs seem to have disappeared.
I think David Murphy's got his light on to speak.
So it would be a direction-setting function undertaken by strategic planning. So within the broad operational budgets within the direction-setting function, but we can point you to the exact part of the draft LTP where that's budgeted after this meeting, if that's useful.
Okay, thank you. And just following on from Councillor Wood's question, in terms of, I understand how it's changed from it being the direction of it being a plan to then it being a fund, because that's what's been included in the social, in the in the housing plan. So, if we wanted to change that, not to be a fund, but just to be the way that council works, would that have to be a resolution on the 3rd of April to change that? Or would that, I guess what I'm asking, so would we have to actually change the housing plan in order for that to change?
So the housing plan was endorsed in February, I believe, containing that action to have a fund. I think that fund proposal has been around since about before October in that form. So you're obviously able to change anything. I guess the 3rd of April is the opportunity to do that, or through deliberations if you wanted to consult on it and then deliberate.
Okay, and just to be clear, it's in the housing plan, but there's no funding included from year two, only year one.
There's no funding for a distributable fund. That's right.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I was interested to explore a little bit the officer's advice around going forward with an unfunded fund, and specifically, I guess where the kind of line is, because it seems to me that there's quite a bit of stuff in the long-term plan that has pretty high kind of uncertainty around it in terms of either the volume of funding or the timing of funding or even whether it's ever going to happen. And in those cases, in many of those cases, we drop a dollar figure in there.
Sure.
And here we haven't taken that path. So what's different about this?
The famous placeholders. I guess my response to that is we did raise it explicitly at the October workshop and asked councillors for, I think it was October, for your views about that. There wasn't any particular guidance about the amount of that fund at that point. I guess from an officer perspective, since we're saying that we're not sure what kind of support's going to be wanted yet, we'd be very reluctant to say that's a $50,000 fund or that's $1 million fund. That's just not for officers to guide that in that way. And given that there has been, I believe, literally no mention of dollars, it's very difficult for us to provide that advice, which is why we've left it as it is at this stage. And it's also why this memo is before you today, so that you're really aware that that is where that's at.
So, thank you. So then in terms of thinking about where we're going in terms of trying to size that, potentially, what can we expect in terms of the information that might come to us in terms of sizing, and will there be optionality in that?
As I said, we haven't really talked about this very much, but just off the top of my head, I'm imagining a councillor workshop, for example, to frame up the kind of things you're wanting us to be finding out about, to scope it a little bit. I think we would then do a wee bit of research with involving community partners and others to talk about the kinds of things they're wanting to be supported through. Any guidance you can give at that point as to, the quantum of that would be helpful, because we don't want to also raise expectations of community about the level of support. And then we would bring some advice back to you as to the kinds of things that those providers would find useful, and then we would shape a fund. Or other support, if that was wanted.
Great, thank you. I think finally then, kind of additionally to those kind of inputs, would there be opportunities to see where around Aotearoa there may be kind of successful uses of fund and see kind of what size, et cetera, is there, and will that information be fed into that process?
Yes, I sort of following on from Councillor Nader's questions, I'd hesitate to sort of commit half a person for a year to do this piece of work. I think it's a relatively small piece of work at this stage, but we would certainly hope to include some information about similar sorts of support mechanisms.
Great, thank you. Madam Chair.
Thank you, Julie. There are no further questions there. Thank you for your report. So I'll move that the committee receive the memorandum entitled Community Housing Partnership Fund Update, presented to the Community Committee on the 20th of March 2024, and look for a seconder. Councillor Naylor. And I'll open up for comments. Councillor Wood.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just thought I'd start by perhaps explaining my tone, because I'm not often a councillor who gets upset or angry about things, but I was really excited to see this report come because we've been waiting for it for 10 months. What we were told, and what we can see in the recommendation, is that we would develop a community housing partnership program plan for consideration for the long-term plan. So I thought, that's great, we've got the report coming to us, now we can consider something for the long-term plan. What's ended up happening, and what we've been told, I think, is a considerable misunderstanding, and I'll take it on good faith that there's been a miscommunication or a misunderstanding of what we were hoping for versus what we're now getting, which is, what we're now getting is, we'll develop the plan in year one and then we'll fund it through an annual budget, which is not what we were told would be able to happen. Initially, I proposed a $20,000 budget for this year that we're currently in to enable this work to be done. What we were told is that we could do that work without the $20,000 budget in this year for it then to be put into the long-term plan. So I was really disappointed to open the paper and see one page which effectively says we haven't done anything and that we're going to work on it next year. Now, I appreciate that it was flagged earlier in the year that the fund would be considered in year one of the LTP. However, my recollection of the discussion we'd had is that the fund was only one aspect of the program of work that we were looking at, and so I thought perhaps appropriate that the fund would be looked at in year one, but the actual plan and program of works that we were hoping to achieve would be done for consideration in the LTP that we're doing now. So I hope that explains my disappointment and perhaps why I ask questions are less kindly way than I usually would. So just to refresh councillors on what was proposed when I spoke about this initially at the annual budget deliberations last year, I spoke about three things. One was support to set up community housing organisations, and that could look like providing free planning advice. So, for example, when Safari Group comes to town, we provide them with free planning advice. Could we do that for community housing partners to provide a low-cost way to help them into the area? Could it look like a grant scheme for community housing aspirational providers to give them that legal and accounting support so that they could set up an organisation? Because when we have groups like the Pacifica community come in and say that they have aspirations of being a community housing provider, but they don't have that technical legal experience or accounting experience, maybe we could assist them in that way to help set up new organisations, not just to fund those that already exist, but to help the community housing sector grow. The second thing I talked about was providing a pathway to access land, because in the conversations I've had, and I imagine a number of you have had with community housing partner providers, the biggest barrier for them providing housing is access to land. And one thing that council does have a lot of is land. Now, would that look like a 100-year long-term lease of land in a development we're doing? Would it look like if we were to redevelop a section of council housing, we go, why don't we give you a long-term lease for 3 of these sections so you can do something on it? I don't know. That's what this plan is supposed to develop. But that was one of the intangible, non-financially burdensome ways that we might be able to help people over that barrier into developing housing for our community. So not a fund, something completely separate, a program and a plan. Or could it look like the sale of land at a low cost, such as what we've, I understand, attempted to do at Tamakuku? There's a whole range of things we could do for the provision of land. The third arm of the Community Housing Partnership Program was a Community Housing Partnership Fund, where we actually provided direct financial assistance to community housing providers. Once they've got set up, once they've got land, then provide them with some funding to actually build the houses. So the whole idea of this is that we take a more holistic look at the whole continuum of providing housing rather than just trying to throw money at it. And so I'm really disappointed in the language that's being used that has become just a fund, because that is not what, certainly as the person who proposed this, that is not what I was trying to achieve. I think there's lots of non-financial ways that we can support community housing providers, and I'd really like to see that progressed, because I think there's a huge opportunity for our community and for our people who are living in cars and emergency houses and motels, that we've now lost 10 months of progress on a policy that I can sit down and write it tonight. I've got it all bubbling around in my head. I'm happy to write 10 pages and submit it through notice of motion so that we can get this going. But it's more than just money. This is about how we provide that wraparound support. So I'll be seeking advice after this meeting with the team as to how we best go about actioning more than just money, because I think we all want to see more than that. We all want to see how that we support local solutions and local providers to meet the needs of their community, because we have hugely diverse needs in our community. What a retiree may need is different to what some of the Pacifica community may need versus in the Māori community versus a solo mum may need. And that's the beauty of community housing partners and providers, is that they can provide housing to fit that tailored need of people. And that's what we as a council struggle with a little bit, because we provide a certain model of housing, so this is how we enable different sectors in the community. So I'm sorry my questions were a bit angry, but I'm just really disappointed, because I think that we can help people, and I think we have a huge opportunity to do so, and I'm disappointed that we've missed that opportunity. So I'll be working with you. I hope, Madam Chair, we can have a conversation afterwards about how we can progress this in a positive and productive way.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and do appreciate the enthusiasm that's being expressed around the table and the sense of urgency on this matter. And while I can't say that I have ultimate sympathy for all the particular things that are being mentioned in terms of optionality coming out of this, certainly keen to see it progress. And I guess a couple of things that I wanted to comment on around, one is kind of around how we do actually gain useful decision support information ahead of or in time to meaningfully influence a long-term plan. And recall sitting in this room last week in your chair, Madam Chair, where we were looking at emission scenarios, and we had given an instruction in 2020 to see emission scenarios come to us in time to inform the long-term plan, and kind of found out through the reporting process last week that really the targets around corporate emissions were going to end up being an output rather than an input, and did have some difficulty with it at that time. And I feel like we're a little bit in that same space here, where there could have been, and perhaps some of that responsibility sits with us around the table in terms of resourcing, but there could have been a stronger position for us to be in coming into the long-term plan than what we face now. I just find it really awkward to have an unfunded fund going in, you know, like how do you actually start that conversation meaningfully then with the community around, is this a direction we want to go, when all we can give them is a really big question mark in a big font and tell them that we might need to come back in a wee while. So I would share Councillor Wood's certainly sense of enthusiasm for moving this at pace and getting to the point where we can signal to the community in some more concrete details what this might look like, and would be keen to see us learning from what others are doing well around the country and seeing what's possible within the context of this community. So probably wrap up there. Thank you, Madam Chair, for the chance to comment.
Thank you. Councillor Naylor.
Thank you. I think this paper has been useful just to perhaps highlight where we have got with this work. I acknowledge that, you know, there has been a direction endorsed in February for it to be a fund that was included in the housing plan. I'm sure I'm not alone around this table who, despite many hours of reading and work, poring over the large quantity of information provided to us in February, didn't pick up on that, the subtlety of that at the time when we endorsed it. I mean, it is good that we do have an opportunity to perhaps adjust that. I personally would be interested in not defining it quite so narrowly as a fund. I'd be interested to see that work progressed, but my interest is more in seeing and being assured that council is an enabler to community housing providers, and if there are any obstacles to that, to looking at how we can overcome those obstacles. I think, in my view, it would be too early at this point to determine that a fund is the right way to achieve that. So perhaps I'll leave it to the April meeting, but if there was support to make that adjustment to the housing plan, then I think that would be a better way forward to better refine this work. But yeah.
Thanks, Councillor. I'll just make a few concluding comments. I think it's unfortunate, perhaps, that we haven't had the research done to know what's required and what type of fund to be able to include it in the long-term plan. But that's where we are now. So we need to kind of move forward. And I think there's a bit of learning here for all of us, perhaps, and maybe a little learning for us as elected members is in terms of providing very clear direction and perhaps following up to make sure that that direction is understood might be useful. I think on top of that, it would be fair to say that staff have been really under the pump in preparing the long-term plan over the last few months. And I think it's almost inevitable that some things may have taken a back seat. So I think we need to understand that. It's been a huge amount of work in a short space of time. So just need to take that into consideration. I don't think there's anything serious lost here. This is a new initiative. It's not like a few months' delay is going to make a significant difference. And I do think it is important to get things right. If we're considering putting in this type of programme, we need to be clear what the needs are of community housing providers and make sure that if we're providing a fund, that it's easily accessible to meet those needs and that it's of a sufficient size to be able to be effective. So, you know, I would, on balance, rather take a little longer and make sure that we get it right, although I appreciate the disappointment of some councillors around the table. But I think, you know, we have to be understanding here the circumstances of developing a long-term plan do put staff under quite a lot of pressure, and it's a very time-sensitive pressure as well. So all that considered, I'm grateful for the memo, and at least we know where we're at, and there's an opportunity, I think, for perhaps Councillor Wood to have a conversation with staff about what's in his mind. Okay, so with that, we will take a vote to receive the memo, please. And that is carried, 8 votes for and none against. Okay, on to the accessibility review, which is item 15. And I will invite Bryce to come and take the chair. Welcome Bryce, in person this time, as opposed to very largely appearing on this screen.
Kia ora, councillors, and yes, sorry, my entrance to this paper isn't quite as glorious as my online one earlier, but happy to present this report. It's the results of a very long and very in-depth piece of work, dating right back to a program that was included in the last LTP. It's looked at everything from physical disabilities and access from that standpoint in terms of things like wheelchairs and mobility issues, right through to things that perhaps this council hasn't always considered in the past, signage, visual disabilities and everything in between. So it is extremely comprehensive. One thing I would say is it is the first part of a greater piece of work. The building work was kicked off first and was somewhat delayed through COVID and some capacity issues through the contractor. So it is about 6 months late, but it is here now, which is fantastic. And then from here there'll be the wider piece of work looking at some of our other infrastructure that'll take place over the next couple of years, which I guess it is worth noting is a pretty reasonable sized piece of work. They'll be traversing every single street in the city and going into quite a bit of detail. Importantly as well, in terms of how we're going to deliver this work, officers and my team in particular are proposing that we can essentially chip away at this work as part of our regular maintenance, our renewals in various facilities, and essentially progressively over the next 3 to 5 years work through what is about 1,200 line items or somewhere there and thereabouts. I guess if councillors would like that to be done quicker, then notably that would have to be considered from a budget standpoint. Whereas if we can do it over the 5-year period, it can be chipped away at and no additional budget is required. So happy to take questions.
Thank you for that. I'll just see if there's any questions. Councillor Naylor.
Thanks, Bryce. The report, thank you for the further advice given earlier this week over the email as well. The original resolution of council back in 2020 actually referred to infrastructure, and I'm just wondering where the review of council-owned buildings, why the infrastructure got turned into just looking at buildings, council-owned buildings.
The original program included in the long-term plan was $100,000 in year 2, and the scope of that program was mentioned facilities and infrastructure. At that time, myself and officers in my team viewed that as a building focus first in terms of facilities, so that was what we did first. Subsequently then, there were some clarifications and a presentation that was made by the Disability Reference Group looking to expand that and clarify what the original intention was, in which case, yes, there was some additional budget added into that annual plan, noting that due to how we've progressed through the building work and that it's only now completed, that work was not completed in that year as originally planned, but it will now be commenced next year through existing budgets.
So the broader infrastructure work will happen next year?
It will commence next year. It is a big piece of work, as I said earlier, so I will be very surprised if it was done within a 12-month period, but it will definitely kick off next year.
Okay, and what engagement, when the scope was established for this work, was there any engagement with the Disability Reference Group to ensure that the intent had flowed into the scope, the development of the scope?
There was at the time. However, unfortunately, I guess upon reflection, that was misunderstood. Hence the original scope only being $100,000 and only being the buildings. But as I referenced earlier, that was subsequently clarified again and then took on board. Unfortunately, just the throughput of this program hasn't progressed quite as quickly as we would have hoped.
So the further resolution in 2022 to clarify the emphasis on infrastructure rather than buildings, in 1.3 on page 275, it said, as the consultant had already been engaged prior to the scope expansion to undertake the building assessment, this work was completed first. So am I understanding correctly that the resolution in 2022 and the budget that was attached to that was supported, that work is yet to begin? Is that what you're saying?
The substantive amount, yes, correct. That
Okay.
work is yet to begin. I say the substantive amount because there is some work in a more broader sense that has been undertaken. I know in the park space, talking to Kathy earlier, we've been doing a little bit of work in the playgrounds when we're upgrading them and looking at things like accessibility. Also from a transport space, accessibility is a key feature when we're looking at things like footpaths and the likes as well. So some of that work has been done, but the substantial go away, engage a consultant to go do the work, no, that has not commenced. Only the building work is completed at this stage.
Okay. Thank you. And the work that Barrier Free have completed, that this report refers to, what was the cost of that report or that work?
It was about $80,000. There was a little bit of officer time on top of that, so we definitely stayed within the $100,000 envelope, but only just.
Okay, and just final question, Madam Chair. The submission to the annual budget in 2022 from the chair of the Disability Reference Group, the current chair and the previous chair, put an offer for officers to meet with the Disability Reference Group to ensure the scope was in line with the expectations. That hasn't happened yet, and as you'd say, that is work that's yet to be started. Do we need any further clarification of that, or will there be some engagement with the Disability Reference Group to ensure that the original intent from 2020 is included in the scope for the work that's yet to begin?
I don't think we need another resolution. It was quite clear,
Yep.
the 2022 resolution, so yes, absolutely. Officers will be engaging before commencing that work.
Perfect, thank you.
Councillor Finlay.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just recently I was at Parliament when the petition was presented to them about access for people with disability. One of the points that was brought up there was the lack of aids for people with stability problems. And I was having a look at the part of you here, we've got stairs and ramps. And like no or a lack of handrails on both sides of stairwells. How many of our buildings have got that problem?
Whilst I pride myself on knowing our asset base very thoroughly, I probably couldn't tell you that off the top of my head of every stairwell and what does or does not have a rail. But the key themes that we tried to present in this report were key themes across a number of our facilities. So I would say that is a common issue. I wouldn't want to say it's the case for every single stairwell.
Yeah. Like, because also I see steep slopes, it just says steep slopes, it doesn't say whether we have sufficient handrails. The one steep slope I can think of with people with disabilities would have trouble is going into the library. Now, I do notice there that I think we've only got handrails on one side. So if we've got someone coming down and someone going up needing that handrail, what happens?
Well, I suppose the best answer I can give to that, councillor, is that was the purpose of this work, to be identifying the gaps and where we may have some issues or some areas for improvement, and so we can start putting a program in place to address those. Probably something I didn't say earlier, which is probably important context. For some cases, in order to address some of these issues, they could be larger pieces of work that we would want to align to some bigger pieces of work. So your example around the library, for instance, depending on what needs to be done around that issue, it could be a simple fix, in which case we would do it in the next couple of years. If it is something that requires more of a substantial fix, perhaps it would be completed as part of the wider library project.
So I couldn't see anywhere here where planned works there that I looked at. I couldn't find anywhere where the plan works to repair or to bring to a safe standard. Do we have that anywhere?
We have, as I said, about 1,200 line items worth of things that were identified. They have been split into priority lists and then a more wider, more substantial fix list. So we do have that. It was just a very substantial document, and hence just tried to provide a bit of a example of the kind of work that was done as an appendix to this report. Absolutely, we could provide that comprehensive list, but it is a rather large document.
Is that list all for accessibility, is it?
Absolutely, everything is for accessibility as per the scope.
That's not a very good, well, to me, to hear that, is, what you say, 1,200?
There's around that. I guess what I would say is, whilst many of these issues, that is a large number of issues and things that we need to be working on. However, it doesn't necessarily mean that our buildings are not compliant. It's areas to be addressed. So, for instance, there's a number around signage and adding braille to some of our messages and things like that have all been included in the scope of this work.
Okay.
So it's pretty comprehensive, and a number of things on that, if I'm honest, the Building Act hasn't traditionally dealt with some of those very well. So this gives us an opportunity to really get ahead of this work and be a bit of a market leader.
Good, thank you.
Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks, Bryce. And yes, good to see you in person. Just interested, I suppose, in what's in paragraphs 5.2 and 5.3, bottom of page 279, where it kind of takes a priority A and priority B approach, and has, quite different timeframes around delivery of those. Are some of the buildings that we're thinking about, or the spaces that we're thinking about, do they have things on both list A and list B?
Correct.
And I guess what consideration, if any, was given to kind of sorting out one space in its entirety rather than needing to come and go over a number of years?
Yeah, it's a very good question. Whilst we've sorted things into priority A and priority B, I guess that was more of a way to try and slowly eat the elephant, I guess, for lack of a better way of saying it. So chipping away at these items progressively. If we were going in to be doing a renewal of a community centre, then that's the time that we would go in and we would address as many of the issues as we possibly could. So I wouldn't say, even though there's an item sitting on priority B list, it may get addressed before that as part of a project. It's really just to demonstrate that we're going to be chipping away at it more than anything.
So to be clear then, am I correct in taking away a message that there's a preference towards doing it once where we can and doing it right?
Absolutely. If we can address it all in one go when we're doing a wider project, then that's the time to be doing it. I wouldn't think we would come back a year later to do another thing just when we could have done it the first time around because it was exclusively on a different list.
Great, thank you. The other area I wanted to explore a little bit, and I appreciate the context you've given us around how we've gotten to a building-focused report, but so the scope of work going forward around understanding accessibility, is that scope literally all public space within the city?
So the work moving forward will be, yes, all council-owned infrastructure, basically, that isn't buildings, since we've done the buildings bit. So that'll be parks, playgrounds, footpaths, road corridors, crossings, which is why I say it is a pretty big bit of work.
And given we got 1,200 lines here, I mean, I guess what kind of level of granularity is that going to be investigated at?
I think that's something that we could explore when we meet with the disability reference group around to how granular you want to get. If we were to do pretty much the same process but in a wider context, you would get very similar detail. But like you say, that might, if this was 1,200 odd items, that might produce 4,000, so it could be quite a bit. And then from there, we would have to consider how best to actually address those. Very similar to the approach that we've looked at here.
Great. Thank you, and wish you well with the work ahead, Madam Chair.
Thank you. That is the end of the questions, Bryce, so thank you very much. So I'm happy to move that we receive the memo entitled Accessibility Review Council-Owned Buildings, presented to the Community Committee on the 20th of March 2024. Look for a seconder. Councillor Naylor. I guess my only comment really is that it's good to see this work being done, albeit it's taken a little time, but it's quite a large scope. And I think the additional scope of public-owned, council-owned infrastructure is also a large scope in its own right. So I'm happy that we are at least making a start on this and taking what I think is a pragmatic approach in doing things when upgrades and repairs are happening anyway, and trying to prioritise some areas over others. So good to see this being started at any rate. Councillor Naylor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yes, I concur with the comments. I think it's definitely good to see some progress, and there's no doubt that the implementation of some of the recommendations in these reports will be of benefit to people in our community who, in terms of making things more accessible. Just want to acknowledge Hugh O'Connell, who's in the room, who's the chair of the Disability Reference Group, and the work that he's done over a long period of time around this piece of work as well. And really just want to acknowledge the relevance of having a disability reference group when it comes to work like this. They were established so that they could have input into this. And I'm sorry to be emotional about this, but this is the exact example of where, if that group was perhaps utilised appropriately, we perhaps may have had a slightly different path for this work since 2020, when Council first put the resolution. So the background to this work is that in 2017, 18, 19, there were numerous issues that were raised by the Disability Reference Group that were quite specific, and you could say minor, but were significant for the people who experienced them. Things like the fact that they couldn't get up the curb on George Street to go to the library because the curb was too big and there wasn't a ramp. You know, it's a significant thing if someone's trying to get there. So as a group, we decided, rather than bring every little issue to the council chamber to say, please could you fix this bit road, is there a more strategic, more broad way that we could have this work looked at, so it's not just reliant on that very long process to address things in our city. The priority really at that time was, and the thing that was being discussed, was people getting from A to B. Can a blind person get across a crossing? Are there the noises that, is there the vibrations? In our infrastructure, is our infrastructure set up to ensure that people who have accessibility needs can get around the city safely and effectively? When it became clear that that had been sort of interpreted as buildings, there was quite an effort made by the group in 2022 to try and get that work back on track. to ensure that the original intent of the resolution from 2020 was well understood, and that offer was put to officers to meet with the group to make sure that the scope was in line with what they were wanting. I guess when I read this report initially, I probably had a similar reaction to Councillor Wood when he read the previous report. I thought, how did we get here? This is not exactly what we'd asked for. I'm really reassured by the officers' comments today that that work that was asked for in 2022 is actually yet to begin. So I guess I just have to be a little bit more patient, and perhaps our disability community have to be a little bit more patient. But I think reflecting on this process, I think where there is limited resource and limited time, it's important that the people who are affected by the decisions we make are consulted to make sure that the priorities are well understood. And I think if we can do that going forward, I think perhaps we might have some more satisfactory outcomes in terms of the way that work's prioritised. In saying that, it's excellent that this piece of work has been completed. And as I say, that will be useful. And the other positive in this report is that that these priority A and B work will be part of the existing maintenance and renewal budget. So whilst it is an expensive piece of work to identify this, it's good that we have got maintenance and renewal budgets that can actually cover the implementation of the recommendations going forward.
Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and concur with much what Councillor Naylor's indicated already. I think probably the main thing that's on my mind at this stage is actually around keeping visibility on this, and I do wonder, and I realize this is a bit on the fly, but if there might be value in asking for an annual reporting against implementation on this until we're certain that we're at a level of momentum that we'd like to see. So I'd just indicate that if there's support in the room, and it sounds like there is, that we would have an additional recommendation to see annual reporting on implementation. If you need me to scroll out words, I can, but...
Well, I think Sina's already typing it up, is she?
Perhaps program implementation or
Yeah.
I don't know what. I want implementation in there.
Yeah, just no of, I think. Just accessibility program implementation. Yep, I think that's it. You're happy to move that, Councillor Barrett?
Yep.
Okay, and Councillor Naylor's happy to second.
I think
Did you
it's
want to
fairly
speak further to that?
self-explanatory from there. I
Okay.
think there's, it is a real priority to make sure that we do keep this visible and ensure that we're building momentum in this. There's a lot of things that have been waiting a long, long time, and they're pretty simple fixes, but just this will give us some surety around it happening.
Okay, thank you. Is there anybody else that wants to speak to this, either the new recommendation or the additional recommendation or the original? Okay. I mean, just to say that, it has taken a little while to get to this point, but still, it is a large piece of work, and I'm reassured that, planning is ongoing for addressing the infrastructure side of things. So I think the annual update report will be useful, just so that we can see that we're continuing to make progress, because often when these things stretch over several years, sometimes they can get a little bit sort of lost as the years go by. So it's good to keep an eye on them. So I support both of these. Okay, in that case, are we happy to take them both together? Yeah, okay, let's vote on these then, thank you. And that is carried 8 for and none against. So that brings us to our last item, which is the committee work schedule, page 349. Ask the Chief Customer Officer, no comment? No, okay. Are there any questions about the work schedule? Okay, well, I will move that we receive the work schedule. Seconded Councillor Zabellin. Any comments? Just a quick comment from me. You'll see that the CAI Resilience Policy has been moved to the Sustainability Committee of the 22nd of May. And my understanding is that that's to enable it to be considered prior to the the long-term plan deliberations. There are another couple of reports as well that will be going to Council at the Council meeting at the beginning of May that would have come here, again, because of timing for long-term plan. So just so people are aware. Okay, comments, we will vote on the work schedule then, please. And that's carried, votes for and none against. So that brings us to the end of the meeting. Thank you all for your participation, staff and elected members. And I'll just finish with a karakia. Kia puta ki te whaio, ki te au marama, whakamoia kia tina, haumie huie taikie. We do have a workshop planned, but I'm not quite sure whether we'll be